Okay, first of all, we want to talk a little bit about applique patterns. When you have an applique pattern, sometimes it doesn't tell you what kind of technique to use to create that applique. So you want to study your applique pattern a little bit. And for today, we're going to be doing two different applique techniques. And the first one, we're going to be using this lightweight iron-on interfacing. When you create an applique out of interfacing, you want to choose these bigger pieces. So the ones I've chosen are the pumpkins, our smiles, and our stems. Now, if you look at the leaves and all of these little parts and pieces that make up the faces, those are a lot smaller. So we're gonna create those pieces using the next technique. So to get started, the first thing we want to do is to trace our pattern. And so when you use iron-on interfacing, you're going to feel the bumpy side of that is the iron-on side. So you'll feel kind of a smooth side and then the bumpy side. So if we want our applique to be showing on our project like it appears on the pattern, then you want to make sure that you trace that with the bumpy side of the interfacing up. So you'll feel that bumpy side or that fusible side up. I'm laying so one thing I would also wanted to mention is on the pattern, do you see how these little pumpkins are overlapped? A lot of times applique patterns will look like that because obviously we're just gonna be tracing one part at a time. So sometimes they are overlapped. So we're gonna do our medium-sized pumpkin. I'm using the water-soluble pen, and I'm marking right on the drawn line of our applique pattern, and this is also going to be the sewing line. So the line that you are marking is also the sewing line. So we're tracing that all the way around, and then I'm going to just rough cut around the outside of that. You don't need to cut it on the line. I'm going to leave, a nice 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. A nice jagged line for Halloween. So we're gonna just rough cut around this applique piece. I kind of like to get some of that excess out of the way. It just makes it a little bit easier to sew. So we'll move this out. All right, so now we have our applique piece. You're gonna take your fabric. Here's our fun little parts and pieces here. When you have the fabric for the applique, I do like to press this beforehand so it's nice and flat with a little bit of starch, gives it a little extra body. When you're going to prepare an applique piece using iron-on interfacing, the most important part of this technique is to remember the rough side of the interfacing goes to the right side of your fabric. And we do not press at this point. So when you're putting these two together, it's going to be the fusible or rough side of the interfacing to the right side of the applique fabric. And it kind of just, you don't need to use a pin. It kind of just stays right in place and makes it really nice and easy to manage. So now let's take it over to the sewing machine. When you get ready to do the sewing, again, remember that your marked line is the sew line. I do like to decrease my stitch length just a little bit. You don't want to feel like it's so tight that you're not moving along, but we do want a little bit tighter stitch length. And we are going to sew all the way around the whole applique. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention is that sometimes when we're going around a curve, we don't want to lift that presser foot lever, so we're kind of smooshing the fabric around. I really want to encourage you to go ahead and stop as you go around appliques. So do you see how this is staying nice and flat here? It's just going to help your applique piece turn out a lot nicer. Just takes an extra minute or two, but I think it'll be worth it for that finished applique piece. See, rather than forcing this around, go ahead and stop, get that presser foot lifted up, and that's just going to help those corners be a lot more smooth in the long run. Then on these straightaways, you can zip right along. Now notice I am not exactly on the line. I never did learn to color inside the lines. So obviously this drawn line is going to be a guideline. This little pumpkin is a lot more folksy, so you will probably be a lot more careful than I am about staying on the line. So we're going to come all the way around. Now you can see how we're coming up on where we started those stitches. I like to continue and go past that beginning point, you know, just a quarter or a half an inch, just to make sure that's really nice and secure. And then we are finished with that sewing part. And now, remember how we tightened our stitch length just a little bit? When you're creating an applique out of the interfacing, the reason we tightened that stitch length is so that we can do a smaller seam allowance when we cut. So now we're going to cut all the way around, and I'm doing what I would guesstimate to be about 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to get too close that you're going to cut into those stitches, but if you do a nice close 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, it's going to make it much more easy to turn this inside out. Now I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Carmen, we just sewed all the way around on this line. How in the world are we supposed to turn this applique? So after you get all this after you get all this trimmed, then we're going to put glasses on for this part. Then just going to be careful to just be poking just into the interfacing, and I'm just cutting. You can cut a straight line. Sometimes it's easy just to do a couple little snips. So what I've done is I've cut just a little X on the interfacing only. So you want to make sure you're not cutting your fabric, just the interfacing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that that you are staying, you know, a good inch and a half away from that edge. I'm going to trim this one up just a little bit tighter. Glasses can come in handy. Okay, so now it's time to turn this inside out, and we have a couple little tricks. Now this pumpkin is a nice easy piece to turn. So we're going to just, you want to be careful not to tear that interfacing. So do you see how I'm concentrating more on the fabric than I am the interfacing as I'm turning this? And I like to do a little bit of a rolling along this edge, because what we're doing when you sew this rough to right, that seam line is nice and defined. So when you come along the edge of this applique and just roll it, what you're doing is you're redefining that edge. Because when we do this applique technique, you don't want to see any of this interfacing sticking out. So what we're really doing is kind of rolling that interfacing to the underside of our applique piece. I don't know why, but sometimes it helps if you lick your fingers when you're doing this rolling. And so you're turning that. Doesn't that look nice? This gives you that nice dimension of the applique, because when we put this on the background, this has now become a fusible applique. And so when we put it on our background fabric, the edges are turned, and so you get that nice dimension of a needle turn applique without doing all that needle turning. So go around it a couple of times and make sure that those edges are nice and turned. And then your next step is you're going to bring it over to your pressing board, and this is where your applique pressing sheet comes in. Like I said at the beginning, the applique pressing sheet is a nice Teflon sheet, and so what that means is that it's really nice and durable. You can put the iron right on it. It's not going to melt it. And in this case, we're going to put our applique down, fusible side down, right? If we did it fusible side up, that would be bad. So you're going to do it fusible side down, and you're going to press this. And when you press your applique on top of the applique pressing sheet, it's doing two things. One, it's pressing your applique nice and flat. But the other thing that it's doing is that it's warming up these edges. And remember how we talked about, we want to redefine that edge, and we kind of want to curl that interfacing to the back side. So when you press this on the applique pressing sheet, it warms up those edges. So if you see a little trouble spot where that interfacing is still showing, then you just give it a little finger press, and you just give it a little roll with your fingers just to help give that some memory and make it stay where you want it. So now you've got a nice little fusible applique with the edges turned. Now before we go on to the next technique, I wanted to show you one of our little stem pieces. Now this one could be done either with the iron-on interfacing or raw edge like we're going to show you next. I chose to do it this way just to kind of show you. But what I wanted to demonstrate is a good way to do the corners. First of all, when you're sewing, I'm going to just point at it so you can see. When you're sewing a corner, the tendency is to sew up to the corner and then just turn and sew the other way. But actually, when you're trying to turn it inside out, you will get a much sharper corner on your applique if you sew up to the corner and then you take one little stitch. Let's get that out of the way. So can you see how I've sewn up to that corner and I've taken just one straight little stitch across? I've heard that called a tailor tack. You're just coming up to the corner, taking one stitch over and then continuing, and then see down on this end, you come up to that corner and then you take one stitch across and then down. Now I've sewn my seam and I've trimmed my seam allowance. This, I'm going to use this tube turner, and not tube turner, a turning tool, and see how I'm poking it on the fabric side. Okay, so we're going to poke this on the fabric side. You want to carefully manipulate that. See how that's coming through? When you're turning your applique inside out, you want to be really careful about not tearing that interfacing. So you want to stay on the fabric side as much as possible. So do you see how here I'm just kind of wiggling that point of this turning tool up into that corner, but I'm staying on the fabric side and away from this interfacing side. And then we'll come over here and gently come up again on that fabric side. And another little trick that I do on corners when I turn them is I just grab it right up close and I give it a little wiggle like this. That just kind of seems to help that fabric kind of wiggle out into that corner. Okay, so now we've turned this inside out. We can take this over to the applique pressing sheet and press it just like we did the pumpkin. So what we have done on this part is we have created the pumpkins, we've done the smiles, and we've done the stems. Now, one thing I wanted to mention as you're doing this project, maybe you don't want to have this be specifically a Halloween jack-o'-lantern, but you would like this to be more of a fall decoration, then you can just leave out the faces of these pumpkins and have a pretty fall motif. So now let's go on to the next applique technique.